for when we reached out. And thank you to Leah, who might be on here. I'm not sure, who helped make that connection. Another Leah spells her name the same way. But so I'm going to go ahead and just start with your bio. So who are we going to be hearing from today? So Jonathan Meyrav, he started showing interest in birds when he was 10 years old, and by the age of 14, earned his banding license and started participating in elaborate monitoring projects in Israel. While a young environmental studies student at Ben-Gurion College, Jonathan fell in love with the desert and desert birding. He would spend entire days monitoring migrants and taking place in surveys and research, and rapidly grew to appreciate the more complicated families such as larks and wheat ears and the incredible birding hotspots of southern Israel. Today, he is the most experienced birding tour leader in Israel, with sharp identification skills and a keen interest in desert birds, migration, and vagrancy patterns. Jonathan spends the migration seasons in Israel and serves as an ambassador for birding in Israel all over the world. Since 2010, he serves as the tourism director of Israeli Ornithological Center, which is now Birdlife Israel. And he still spends around 90 days a year guiding foreign birdwatchers, donors, and birding tour groups. Jonathan and his team have developed several large-scale international events, the Hula and Eilat birding festivals, seminars around bird conservation, and more. And in recent years, he devotes most of his time to the Champions of the Flyway Project, which is an international bird race that takes place in Eilat, Israel, every spring. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thanks for having me. On normal times, I do spend a lot of time leading foreign birders here in Israel, and also spend significant amounts of time overseas. And then 2020 came and basically stirred the pot for everyone. And I was just talking to my wife that this is the first time in 25 years that we haven't left the country a whole year, which is pretty nuts. So we're really optimistic that now there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, and we can all carry on, go back to traveling, to enjoying birds, enjoying wildlife. We can only hope. So I'll just share my screen. Leah, could you just admit those that come into the waiting room? Thank you. All right. So, as Leah mentioned, I work for the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel. We are basically, we'll get to that a bit later, but we are an environmental non-government organization, which basically means that we do whatever we can to protect nature, and we're also not tied into all the politics. So we can seriously oppose, for example, government planning, municipal plans. Israel is a tiny country and the pressure on nature is immense. So let's get right to it. So people that know about Israel and Israel's birding usually envision something like this. This is a small part of a flock of 14,000 white storks that arrived in the Bet Shean Valley, the northern part of the Jordan Valley. And this is what Israel is to many visiting birdwatchers and birdwatchers worldwide. It's a haven of migration. We have a huge migration corridor. And as mentioned in the intro, Israel is a tiny country. We're only 300 and a bit miles from north to south, and 500 kilometers or so. And yet we have over 500 and, well, nearly 550 species of birds that have been documented in Israel. Now, why? Just for comparison, if you look at the whole, we are about the size of New Jersey, maybe a bit smaller. and the whole ABA list of birds seen in North America is scratching 1,000 species. And little old us have 550 species, which is quite remarkable. And a part of this talk you're gonna understand why Israel is such an amazing place for bird watching. So this is a picture that dates back quite a while, and that shows what us Israelis like to think, that we are the center of the world. Most Israelis in Israel would like to think that we are right there in the middle. And this picture, of course, talks about the whole religious aspect of Jerusalem being the center of the world. I really like this picture because you see that Israel sits smack in the middle of the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this could not be it's exactly why Israel is such a phenomenal place for birding. If we look at a more simplistic chart, we see Israel in the middle, Eilat, southern Israel is highlighted. And we see some of the migration routes that birds choose in order to migrate back and forth through Israel. We are the only or the main land bridge between the three continents, east of the Mediterranean Sea, the only strip of land that basically connects the whole Eurasian landmass to Africa. And complete populations of birds that nest in northern latitudes in Europe and in Asia migrate to Africa to spend the winter, very much like your flyways in the US, where birds nesting in Canada and the northern US migrate south to the tropics for the winter. And the same thing goes on in the old world. And our flyway is one of the biggest flyways in the world when it comes to diversity of species and number of individual birds. You can see this is, of course, pretty simplistic, but I'll show you something a bit more concrete. This is a map that was developed through over 200,000 observation points through the eBird system. I'm sure some of you know eBird. eBird is basically a program software where birders can upload their sightings, doing it daily. And it's become probably the biggest and most important tool for citizen science in ornithology, in the birding world. I think there's over 200,000 people that submit observations worldwide. And here we see the three major flyways throughout the whole world. You can see your flyway on the left, mainly the Atlantic flyway along the East Coast. The West Coast is a bit hidden. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we see the big flyway of Asia, of birds migrating south to India and that direction. And in the middle, we see the big flyway around the two sides of the Mediterranean Sea, with Israel being right here, right in the thick of things. Birds that come all the way from deep Siberia, Western Asia, areas like Kazakhstan, that area basically migrate along this flyway, not crossing the Mediterranean Sea, but remaining over the land strip that is Israel and down into Africa to winter, normally south of the Sahara. So this really gives a nice graphic impression of just how dense the migration corridor really is. So as mentioned, I work for the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel. We were founded in 1953. We are the Birdlife International partner in Israel. Birdlife International is a big bird conservation international organization that has partners in over 100 countries. We are the largest environmental NGO in Israel with over 36,000 members in SPNI. Now, in the picture, you see a bulbul. A bulbul is a very special bird, a very common garden bird in Israel. I'm trying to think, it's maybe similar to your grackles or something along those lines. But it's a unique family of the old world. Now, I mentioned that the Society for Protection of Nature was founded in 1953, and the reason that it was founded is what you see here in these pictures. These are pictures from the early 1900s of the Hula Lake, the Hula Swamp. There was a big body of water, the Hula Lake in northern Israel. It was a very, very shallow, brackish lake, which served as a funnel or basically all the organic material coming down from the Golan Heights on one side and the Galilee on the other. All this water spilled down into this valley, the Hula Valley, and the Hula Lake was an incredible ecosystem, amazing wetland, very, very rich in wildlife and plants. You can see the bottom picture, the world's northernmost papyrus reeds, the same papyrus reeds that were used to create paper. The old Egyptians used them to make paper. The northernmost papyrus reeds were here in the Hula Lake in northern Israel. And Israel's young government, the first government of Israel, decided that it's going to drain the Hula Lake in order to clear areas for agriculture. Now, Israel was a very young country, and environmentalism and conservation was not something that was on people's minds at the time. And this massive project of drying the Hula Lake was personally backed by David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, which saw great importance in agriculture and pioneering. And he said, we will actually be able to dry this lake and create land and clear land for people to cultivate and grow crops. At the time, there were a few young biology students and conservation-oriented activists that raised their voice against the drying of the Hula Lake. And of course, mainly two people. They were students, young at the time, but despite their effort and despite them going and personally meeting politicians and so on, the project came to be. It took 7 years from 1952 until the late 50s. The whole Hula Lake was drained and dried, clearing areas for agriculture. After the drying of the lake, I won't get into it, but it turned out to be a bad decision for various reasons. But when it comes to birds, to nature, to wildlife, it was a horrible decision because it was such an important wetland, and several species of wildlife have become extinct after drying the Hula Lake, namely the Hula painted frog. This beautiful amphibian you see on the bottom right is a frog that inhabited this swamp, and after the drying of the lake became extinct. There's a twist in the story because a few individuals were refound in 2012 after being missing for 60 years or so. They were refound, but besides the frog, several species of rodents and over 20 species of birds have never nested in Israel again after the drying of the lake. This whole battle, this whole struggle for conservation is what led to the founding of the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel. And the first nature reserve in Israel was the Hula Valley Nature Reserve. So it was not for nothing that the Hula Lake was drained. What we do, basically protecting nature, conserving, restoring, creating habitats, intensive monitoring and surveying, educating, and very, very important is public campaigns. Like I said, Israel is a tiny country. Every place you develop is going to encroach on nature. Our population is exploding. We're already close to being I think, the most heavily populated country in the OECD. And we're going to get more and more complicated as the years move on. So within SPNI, we have a branch called Birdlife Israel, and this is what we do, mentioning the monitoring. We have a team that all they do is field work, atlases, breeding programs, monitoring of sensitive habitats. And then the data that is collected through the monitoring department is then used with decision makers. If they want to build a new neighborhood on the outskirts of the town of Modi'in, for example, or on the outskirts of Jerusalem, we're going to be there and say, look, this area that you're planning to build on is rich with endangered species, or it has specific individual plants, wildlife, birds, and we are not taken for granted. I mean, we do have a power over decision makers when it comes to planning and development, and this is because of a strong monitoring department. Outreach and conservation, SBNI works with over 100 schools in Israel, teaching nature conservation, and my branch, the tourism branch and international events, ecotourism, birding trips to Israel, wildlife trips to Israel, hiking trips to Israel. All these, you're better off spending your money with us than with a private tour company, because the money that you spend with us is diverted from the tourism branch directly to the conservation branch. And today we work with some of the leading birding tour companies in the world, Victor Emmanuel, Field Guides, others from the States, some European companies, and they see the value in spending their money and having us operate their birding tours, again, because their money does make a difference on the ground. Back to the Jordan Valley and to that flock of storks that took off. This is a picture looking east. I'm standing in the middle of the Jordan Valley, looking to the hills of Jordan beyond the border. And this Rift Valley serves as a funnel and as an amazing corridor for huge populations of birds, soaring birds, and others. If we go south a little ways, to the other side of the country, to the Eilat Mountains, the Eilat Mountains serve as a funnel as well for birds moving north during the spring. After birds spent the winter in Africa, they have to migrate back to their breeding grounds, and they migrate with the Red Sea. They fly along that Rift Valley that we mentioned. They have the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea on their right, and the massive granite ridges of the Eilat Mountains on their left, causing this beautiful funnel effect. In this case, we see honey buzzards, and honey buzzards, something like 90% of the world population migrates through Israel twice a year. Very busy season. In 20 days, we get 450, 500,000 individuals migrating through. Mornings of 70, 80,000 honey buzzards over the Eilat Mountains are an annual thing. And this is a honey buzzard. Look what a beautiful bird of prey. It's a unique bird of prey. It's not really, it's slightly related to what you call hawks, the buteos. In the old world, we call your hawks buzzards. But honey buzzard is not even that. It's a different kind of animal. You can see how dainty the legs are. This bird does not use its legs to fiercely catch prey like some other birds of prey. As its name applies, honey buzzards eat flying insects and mainly bees and wasps and hornets in the forests of Europe. They have a very special build. They have a very thin nostril with a nostril flap. So they can basically stick their heads right into the wild beehives and nosh on the bees and also on the honeycomb itself. It's a really beautiful, dainty, delicate bird of prey. And we're very, very fortunate to get nearly the whole world population move through Israel. Another important bird of prey that migrates through Israel is the steppe eagle. Steppe eagle, it's a large aquila eagle related to your golden eagle, one of the more powerful birds of prey, large wingspan, very powerful bird. Amazingly enough, nearly the whole world population are ground nesting birds. They nest in the plains of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And in these vast open plains, there aren't any trees. So they usually choose like a flat bush or sometimes a small hedge of stone or something like that. And that is where they build their nest, no more than 4 feet above the ground. And this amazing bird migrates through Israel, again, a large chunk of the world population twice a year. Now, why is this important? If I'm a researcher that wants to study the population of steppe eagle, for example, as I mentioned, they nest in remote areas in the middle of vast, vast prairies. And if I wanted to have a sample of several individuals, I would need to drive hundreds and hundreds of miles and see a pair here, a pair there. It will take so much effort just to document enough individuals that it's just not worth the effort. But if you sit in the Eilat Mountains from mid-February to mid-March and count every single steppe eagle that flies over your head going north, that will give you the most accurate estimate of the world population of steppe eagles. So by sitting at a migration hawk watch point in Israel and counting the birds of prey, we are able to get a very clear picture of complete world bird populations, which is quite a remarkable thing. Yeah, this is one of those steppe eagles as it soars directly over my head. Means business, flying directly north. They usually pass Eilat, fly about 60, 70 miles along the Rift Valley, and then break east over Jordan, over Saudi Arabia, and then up to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Here's a small collection of some of them might move through Israel. As you can see, we spoke about these incredible soaring birds, storks, eagles, the buzzards, amazing birds of prey, but they're lazy. These guys, these little guys are the true heroes, the true warriors of migration. If you look at, for example, this little guy here, a small Sylvia warbler, this little guy nests somewhere in Poland or in Hungary or in Germany, and come fall, it basically migrates south on its own, strict wing power. They do not soar. They rely on strict wing power, just like your warblers. They migrate at night on their own and strictly with the power of their wings. And they fly all the way to Africa, spend 3-4 months in Africa, and then fly all the way back to that same garden, that same hedge in Hungary, Poland, or Germany where they left, and breed once more. There is nothing more remarkable than a bird that weighs like a bag of ketchup at McDonald's, that is able to use so much power, efficiency, burn off energy in such an amazing way. And I'm not even getting into navigation, which is really a world wonder, how a bird of this size with a brain the size of half of your fingernail is able to navigate in ways that we would never be able to figure out. Researchers spend a lot of time trying to crack this navigation on migration and migration in general. The more we know, the more questions we have. So this is a small collection. Again, we have kingfishers, common kingfisher. This is a bird that does not nest in Israel. It nests in Europe, but they spend the winter with us. Red-backed shrike, a bird of Mediterranean climates. Rufous bush robin, masked shrike, blue throat. This is an amazing little bird that actually there are some records in Alaska from the Siberian population. There are records in the US. Our blue throats come from Scandinavia. They migrate south from Scandinavian countries, spend the winter with us, and fly right back up. We have a common red start on the top left, and in the middle, a Levant sparrowhawk, which is a raptor, but a small, flappy bird that migrates most of the way by wing power as well, rather than soaring like the big guys. So we spoke of the amazing migration corridor, and now talk about another very big reason why Israel is such an amazing place for birds. First of all, this is a shot from my garden, a Palestine sunbird, or also known as orange tufted sunbird. This is the closest thing that we have to a hummingbird in this part of the world. And it's a very special bird because we like to think of them as the Zionist birds. This is a bird that used to live only in small parts, oases along the Dead Sea in the Judean desert. And as Israel developed as a country in the 60s and 70s, 80s, and flowering gardens became a regular thing, these little guys, which are tiny, slowly started spreading and colonizing every single place that they arrived. And now they're a very common bird anywhere in Israel. I live in central Israel, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. and I have at least 2 pairs nesting on my property. Really awesome birds. And we mentioned the size of Israel. Now, we're small, 320 miles top to bottom, but within that tiny sliver of land, there are very, very diverse habitats. And that's what also makes Israel an amazing place for birds and wildlife, biodiversity in general. From Mount Hermon in the far north of Israel, our only snow-capped mountain, only ski hill in Israel, in the far north of the country, which actually last week got its first significant snowstorm and now is nice and covered in white. Down to the Eilat area, the Egyptian border, which is strict, extreme desert, and everything in between. The Mediterranean coast with a beautiful beach, remnants of swamps and large areas of fish ponds, the semi-desert area of the northern Negev, and everything in between. So first, we have a massive migration corridor for birds that don't necessarily nest in Israel. And then we have this huge diversity of habitats, which every habitat hosts specific species. And that is another factor to the richness of the avifauna of Israel. On top of this, Israel is a meeting of zootopical zones. That basically means that we have representatives from every single continent. If we look at Asian species, such as the jungle cat, Asian jungle cat, a cat that comes all the way from India, we are the westernmost point in the world where you can see jungle cats, and the same goes for this white-throated kingfisher. We are the westernmost spot on the globe where these Asian species live. Same for some European species. We have the European bee-eater on the left, which is a real Mediterranean bird of Mediterranean climates. And we have the European greenfinch on the top right, 2 birds which are of Mediterranean European origin, and we are the easternmost point where these birds breed. And the same goes for African species, such as this jackal that we see eating a crane leg, and the Namakwa dove, which is a small dainty dove that comes from Africa. You get the picture. Large migration corridor, diverse habitats, and meeting of zootopical zones. These 3 factors are what make Israel so rich and such an amazing place for birding. Over 200 breeding species, again, representatives from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. And the count now is scratching 550 species. We find a new bird for Israel almost every year. This past year, we had 3 new birds for Israel in 2020. Pardon the Hebrew, for those that do not read Hebrew, but this is a table that basically talks about the number of bird species per 1,000 kilometers square. So Israel, with a land space of about 23,500 kilometers square, have, so to speak, 530 species, which is 22.5 species of birds per 1,000 square kilometer. If you compare it to the UK, they have 2. If you compare it to Germany, they have 0.73, and so on and so forth. The same goes, we spoke about this biodiversity. It's not just birds. Look at what's happening with plants. If you look at the table, California, which is huge, we are 29,600 square kilometers, and we have over 2,600 species of plants in Israel. The density is 87.8 species of plants per 1,000 square kilometers. That's pretty amazing. Sadly, the same goes with the number of tanks. We also have the highest density of tanks per 1,000 square kilometer than almost anyone else in the world. We have some incredible birds that go back a very, very long way. This is a turtle dove. This is the dove that is mentioned in the scriptures, in the Song of Songs, and the cooing of the dove was heard through the land. This dove was once so common in Israel. I'm talking back in biblical times. Isaiah, the prophet, The cooing of this dove was the symbol of spring. When you could hear the cooing, it means that the spring has arrived. The doves winter in Africa, and they come back in March, mid-March or so. They start coming back to Israel from the wintering grounds. And even then, 3,000 years ago, this cooing of the dove was heard through the land. Sadly, this is a species that is not common anymore. In Hebrew, the name of this dove is Tor Matsui, the common dove. It was once so common. Sadly, it's being hunted in huge numbers illegally and in some places legally. And this is a bird that we like to think of as the modern day passenger pigeon, a bird that was once so common that everyone knew, but now it's seriously declining. I won't get into it, but we have some very important projects worldwide to protect this turtle dove. And we mentioned Champions of the Flyway before. It's a bird race that's all in the name of conservation. But there is a connection to the birds of Israel that goes back thousands of years into the scriptures. Another one of those is this beautiful hoopoe. Hoopoe, Israel's national bird as well. In this case, this individual I photographed in the middle of the city in some city park. It's actually taking a sun bath. It sits in the sun, spreads its wings, opens up its feathers, heats it up in the sun, and then the parasites drop off the bird. Hoopoes are a sign of wisdom. It's said that King Solomon, the wisest of people, the wisest of men, that used to speak the language of animals, used to consult the hoopoe. The hoopoe was considered to be a wise bird. And it said if some of you know a little bit about the Gemara and things like that, there's the whole story with the Queen of Sheba that wanted to form an alliance with King Solomon. And one of the people or one of the beings that King Solomon consulted was the hoopoe. The hoopoe told him, she's cool, go with it. And then there was an alliance with the Queen of Sheba. Hoopoe is a very common bird in Israel. And I mean, you look at this thing, it's just captivating. Because we are so tiny, migration is everywhere in Israel. I mean, I'm sure some of you guys in California as well, and in Texas, in the more desertic areas, during migration periods, you can find migrants almost in any green space. Any tiny park or garden or something in the desert will turn up migrants. They find these little oases, man-made oases, in order to fuel up on migration. This is a common quail, another bird heavily mentioned in the scriptures, miracle of the quails, so on and so forth, when the people of Egypt, when the people of Israel were coming out of Egypt. It's said that God basically bestowed numerous quails and they just walked around and picked them up. Now, it sounds magical, it sounds like an amazing miracle, but the fact of the matter is that quails behave like this. And it's mentioned during the month of Nisan. The month of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar is Passover, and Passover is the spring and peak time for migration of quails through Egypt and through the Sinai and through Israel. And it's not, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a grain of truth in that story where basically the people of Israel stumbled upon a fall of quails, thousands of very, very tired, exhausted quails, and just walked around and picked them up and ate them. This is something that happens when you find exhausted quails on migration. This is a bird that I photographed in the middle of a parking lot in Tel Aviv. You can see the car parked behind. This is the tire and the rear end of the car. I came over there to do some birding, parked my car, and this thing was running in between parked cars in the parking lot. So migration really is everywhere. This is another example. This is a bird called a wryneck, W-R-Y, a very special bird related to woodpeckers. It nests deep in old growth forests in Europe. And if you want to look for these guys on the breeding grounds, it's nearly impossible to get good views. They've got this very cryptic plumage. They walk up and down tree trunks like woodpeckers. And this guy on migration, I photographed on a median in the middle of the city of Eilat, and it was so focused on eating. It was so tired from migration. It was picking up ants off the grass in the middle of a city, which is pretty remarkable. We have over 2 million soaring birds migrating over Israel every year. The whole European population of white pelicans is something like 50,000 individuals. We have black storks, which is a bird. People are familiar with the white storks. They have a rarer relative called the black stork, a beautiful stork that winters in Israel in good numbers. And this is a very interesting bird of prey. It's called a lesser spotted eagle. And you remember I mentioned before that migration counts in Israel can give a good estimate of the whole world population of specific species. Then an interesting story that in the 1980s, when migration counts started in Israel, one of the species that we counted was a lesser spotted eagle. The whole world population as a whole migrates through Israel twice a year in a very dense period of time. So the early counts, we counted, 120, 130,000 individuals every migration season. And then sometime in the mid 80s, late 80s, the numbers were dropped in half. Suddenly, we only counted 55,000, 60,000 individuals, 50% of what the counts were before. And we had no idea what was going on. And on the breeding grounds, there was no way to study these birds. It took a couple of years before somebody made the connection that the core of the breeding grounds of lesser spotted eagles is the Chernobyl area in the Ukraine. The famous meltdown of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor, and the whole immediate area was affected, hundreds of miles on the perimeter. And this hit the population of lesser spotted eagles and others very, very hard. And this was something that, again, was learned only from following counts in Israel. There was no way to study this back in Chernobyl. We just saw that the numbers were declining. I'm happy to say that by now they've bounced back and they're doing okay. But again, lesser spotted eagles winter migrate through Israel and choose traditional roost sites. This is a specific forest, the Ben Shemen forest, where every year during the last week of September, the first week of October, the whole world population of lesser spotted eagles moves through with thousands and thousands of individuals stopping to roost on these conifers and cypress trees. I'm lucky to live 5 minutes from here, but it's quite a remarkable thing that from Tel Aviv, very, very close, you drive off and you can find yourself in a forest full of eagles. And to see the takeoff of lesser spotted eagles is a memorable sight. Here are a few pictures taking off from the forest. This is what it looks like. And this very, very dense migration corridor can also pose problems, especially to a country that cherishes its Air Force and needs its Air Force to train. Here is a radar shot from a very busy day of migration of lesser spotted eagles. We can see the radar is sitting right here, Ben Gurion Airport, and the stream of eagles starts well north of Tel Aviv and finishes in Kiryat Gat. 70 kilometers of eagles on migration. Thousands and thousands and thousands of birds. Needless to say that during this day, planes did not train effectively around this area. We have a very good partnership with the Israeli Air Force, and there are, following 30 years of research and work together with the Israeli Air Force, today pilots already during their training are exposed to the dangers of this very, very small airspace. Again, Israel has a tiny airspace, and like I said, we need to be quite efficient with our Air Force. We're not allowed to fly over neighboring countries, over Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, needless to say. Only about 20 miles in the Mediterranean, we can't fly over Egypt, leaving a very, very narrow area, not enough place for, for an F-16 to even go full throttle without, escaping outside the borders. And if you stick into this tiny airspace 2 million soaring birds a year, you can imagine the potential for danger. Nowadays, the partnership is in, and knock on wood, there are very, very few collisions between aircrafts and soaring birds on migration in Israel. I mentioned the pelicans, really very similar to the American white pelican, slightly smaller, such a beautiful bird, and even more so when you see a flock of 2,000 that stops on migration, every one of them with a 9-foot wingspan, weighing close to 20 pounds. So it's quite an impressive congregation. I mentioned this is what I do. I generate funds through birding tourism, basically. We have two main festivals, the Eilat Bird Festival in the spring, the Hula Valley Bird Festival in the late fall and early winter, and we do tailor-made tours throughout the whole year for various people, both companies and private individuals. This time of year, this is where we put our main focus. Hula Valley, which I mentioned before, our story started with the draining of the lake of the Hula Valley. Nowadays, parts of the valley were reflooded and host 30 to 40,000 common cranes every year. This is slightly similar to Bosque del Apache in New Mexico, where you have huge congregation of sandhill cranes. This is the same thing, but the birds are much closer, which is quite an amazing thing to see. And especially this little contraption, which is called the mobile hide. This is started from a farmer that used to cultivate the fields. As he drives his tractor around where the cranes are feeding, they don't care. They're not threatened by this piece of agricultural machinery. So he said, you know what? Instead of my plow or my cultivator, I'll put a hide in the back of the tractor and see if I can, drive people through the cranes. And it started with a very small hide for two people, like a photographer's hide with a narrow slit as a window, and slowly evolved to this contraption you see today, taking 40 people at a time. The mobile hide tours are a must thing to do in the Hula Valley, a memorable experience, especially the sunrise and sunset trips when the cranes leave the roost sites in the morning or fly back to the roost. Just the noise, the views, near spiritual. And the Hula Valley is also an incredible place for rare birds of prey. Eastern imperial eagle, one of the rarest eagles in the world, around 3,000 pairs left. Israel is the best place to see them during the winter months. So it's not just migration, it's also winter. A greater spotted eagle, also a bird with only a few thousand pairs left, and a few hundred winter in Israel, spend the winter with us. But our jewel of the crown, again, are the deserts of Israel and our amazing families, such as wheat ears that we mentioned. Wheat ear has nothing to do with wheat or with ear. The name wheat ear actually comes from an old folk language meaning white rear or white arse, basically. Wheat ear means white rear. All these birds have white rumps and a very diagnostic tail pattern. This is where they get their name. Israel has 13 species of wheat ears, one of the highest density of wheat ears anywhere in the world. The desert has got some incredible garden birds. This is Arabian green bee eater, and this was shot behind a gas station somewhere in the desert. There was a little pool with some reeds, and the bee eaters are just mind-bogglingly beautiful, charismatic birds, and are very, very common in the deserts of Israel. But probably the bird, the most iconic bird that bird watchers that come to Israel search for is the McQueen's bustard. This is a bird the size of a turkey, very, very impressive ground nesting bird. And Israel has the last wild population of McQueen's bustards anywhere in the world. This is a bird that used to be common in Arabia and into Asia, but hunted completely to extinction. And Israel has about 200 individuals, 240 individuals, a steady population for the past 30 years. And this is a must-see on any of our Israel tours. They have an amazing display where the males throw their heads back, puff up their breast feathers, and basically dance around like crazy, trying to impress the females. It's really the jewel of the crown of Israel's birding. Next to it are also other charismatic species, such as cream-colored courser, which is a wader that has absolutely nothing to do with water. The open areas of the southern deserts attract amazing numbers of larks, including this Temminck's lark or Temminck's horned lark, very similar to the horned larks in the US, but a native of the Israeli deserts. This beautiful pink color is something that, is not seen in any other bird. And the experience of going out to the desert at 5:30 in the morning, it's still dark, the sun is slowly coming up, and hearing the fluting calls of Temminck's larks in the desert is something that will stick with you always. Another rare lark of Israel's deserts, the terrestrial parrot, thick-billed lark, a nomad, amazing life story, amazing hardy bird, built to endure the hardest conditions, to crack the hardest of seeds in the desert, and another very highly coveted species to see while in Israel. The famous Sinai rosefinch, another one of the gems of the Israeli deserts, a bird that you need to, surprising how hard they are to see despite being so brightly colored and beautifully pink. And we have two super rare enigmatic night birds, the Nubian nightjar on the bottom left, something like 60 pairs left, again, in the world most likely of this subspecies, only to be found in the southern Dead Sea areas. They need a specific salt marsh in order to breed. And on the top right, the desert owl, tawny owl, also mentioned by the prophet Isaiah 3,200 years ago as a white owl, a white lilit, heard on the outskirts of Jerusalem, aka the Judean desert. So to wrap it up, I mentioned that we are an NGO. A large part of our budget relies on, the goodness of donors' hearts. We have amazing things going on. You can log on to our website, birds.org.il. There's a beautiful English website. You can sign up to our new e-newsletter there. We'll welcome any donation, and we're more than happy to take you out and see some birds the next time you come to Israel. You can contact us, you can contact me. And this was just really a bit of a taster about the amazing birding and birds Israel has to offer. So I'd like to thank you and wish you all good health, that we may all travel again soon. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I know we did have a couple of questions. Okay, one second. I think maybe her hand went down, but I know one of the questions was, how have the balloon bombs from Gaza affected the migrations? And I'm just to sort of open that up, how has any bombing on all of Israel ever impacted bird migration? Is where I'll explain.
The simple question is that it hasn't. For birds, booms here and there are just like a thunderstorm. And I don't know what you hear over there about the balloons from Gaza, but even during the time where there were, multiple incidents every day, we're talking about, a strand of balloons flying slowly through the sky. Missiles can be, more startling, alarming. Luckily, it doesn't happen often anymore. And like I said, for birds, some missiles flying around are not very different from a thunderstorm or, so we don't see any effect, thankfully.
Another question I saw was, how does the bird migration and sort of the airline industry or even the Israeli Air Force how do they navigate that without impacting in any sort of negative way these beautiful birds that are crossing?
So the main problem lies with fighter planes, fighter jets that travel in high speeds. When people think about collisions between birds and aircrafts, eh, what people think is usually birds being sucked into motors or something like that on runways as planes take off. But the fact of the matter is that a large percentage of all air strikes are direct impact hits, where a fighter jet travels at high speed and hits a bird. Even a small bird, it can create significant damage when the plane is flying at very high speeds. If you're driving along the highway, I mean, there's that simple physical rule that E1 equals E2. The bird hits the plane at the same speed, at the same force that the plane hits the bird, basically. If you're driving along the highway and there's a truck in front of you, moving gravel, and you're doing 60 miles an hour and a little stone falls off the truck and hits your windscreen. If you're doing 60, it's going to make a loud bang and nothing will happen. But if you're doing 70 or 75, that same stone falling at that same speed will crack your windshield. And that's a good example. So, like I said, for 30 years, the Air Force has worked with us with birders on the ground during migration seasons. I coordinated this survey for 8 years. Basically, teams of birders spread through the width of the country from the eastern border to the Mediterranean Sea, intercepting flocks of birds, radioing in to various towers and Air Force bases, and this is funneled directly to the cockpit of the fighter plane, and he knows to steer clear. After a few years with the development of technology, now the Air Force operates specific radars to detect these flocks of birds. But even this day, we have a sort of an A team that in some situations, they call upon birders on the ground to go see if these are birds or not. It has to do with topography. It has to do with the fact that a large part of the migration corridor is below sea level. You know, Israel, the Dead Sea, the Judean desert, lowest place in the world. But this partnership is very, very successful. And like I said, back in the 1970s, 1980s, there were up to 20 hits, accidents between aircrafts and birds every single year in Israel. Now we're down to less than one a year. So with time, it works. And like I said, it's embedded into the Air Force, into the pilots' training. They know which seasons and where not to fly.
Before we get to this question, I don't know if you saw, are there any student programs for birding?
Yes, there are student programs for birding. We work with several of the universities, the Technion and several of the other establishments, and we do courses. Students come and get credit by working on one of our bird watching centers, either as volunteers. We can't take a student with just general interest to do actual monitoring or field work. You need a bit of a training period, but we do work with a variety of institutes. And if you're coming to Israel, you or anyone from your family that wants to get involved, again, go to birds.org.il. You can contact us through there, and we'll be happy to get you busy. Douglas is asking, when do you think I can sign up to tour Israel for birds wildlife? Yeah, I've actually been to the Platte River in Nebraska, Douglas, thank you. It is mind-blowing. And when can you sign a tour? I have Victor Emmanuel and Naturalist Journeys, two companies that are lined up for our November trip, November 21. We're not canceling them yet. I really, really hope that things, luckily in Israel, it seems that the vaccination scenario is going just about as good as can be. We're up to 3 million people vaccinated already. Over a third of the population of Israel. And we're hoping that many other places go, follow suit, and that the bloody skies open again. We're waiting for you whenever you can.
Okay. And then one more question before we sort of close it up. I noticed on the main, Apple News, for example, the most important stories listed was one about bringing back the most endangered bird in the US, about the grasshopper sparrow in Florida. What makes a bird, how can you tell if a bird is the most endangered species, and what sort of work does it take to bring back a species that is nearly extinct? So
It all begins and ends with one word, and that's habitat. All right, habitat loss, and such a sparrow, and generally all these sea marsh sparrows, these salt marshes and these sea grasses and along the East Coast and in other places are disappearing rapidly. And when a habitat is gone, the birds that live there disappear. And that is also why it's challenging to bring back captive and to, reestablish or reintroduce species that have disappeared. Because you can have a wonderful, for example, this sparrow, you can have 100 fertile individuals in an aviary somewhere, but if the habitat is gone or is not quality enough for them to return, then there's no point in reintroduction. So one of the most important things, this is something that man learned, the hard way by trying to return species too fast, also mammals in various places. And yeah, I mean, it's all about the habitat. We need to protect them in the first place. And then if we're thinking about reintroduction, we need the habitat to be potent and quality enough to absorb that reintroduction.
well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for doing this. I mean, this is, this is such an incredible phenomenon that happens here. And I really do hope all of you on this call can at some point connect with Jonathan and Birdlife Israel. Jonathan, if you can put in the chat box, if you don't mind right now, the website one more time so people can,
Sure.
Sign up for your newsletter and all that jazz. For those of you who are on this program today and haven't come to our Jewish World Tour before, and you're not on our listserv, please shoot me a message right now and send me your email, and you can find out about all our upcoming programs. We've been to Israel, Brazil. Our next program we are going to be doing on Monday, February 8th at 7:30 p.m. So this is a nighttime program. It's called Border Town Mexican Jews of Tijuana, San Diego. We'll be hearing from Isaac Ardenstein, who's the producer and director of the award-winning documentary Tijuana Jews, and related to Vivian Alberts, and also Gregorio Goldstein, who's a businessman and the honorary consul of Israel in Baja, Mexico. Again, that's Monday, February 8th at 7:30. And just take note, the link you got today is the link we'll be using moving forward for all travel programs. So you don't have to keep registering. But with that said, again, thank you so much, Jonathan. Please do, stay in touch with Birdlife Israel, and hopefully we'll all get to meet you in person at some point.
Yeah, the West Coast was on our globe-trotting plans for 2020. I was supposed to be there in September. Again, before all hell broke loose. So hopefully once things calm down, I have quite a lot of business to do along the West Coast, and I'll be more than happy to come down and speak to you guys in person.
Would love for that. Sounds terrific. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and hope to see you again soon, and all the best to you, Jonathan.
All right, guys, have a good day. Good night from Israel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.